Phaedrus presents In this video, I'd like to provide a few more of the concrete sources of evidence that the transverse flute in the 16th and 17th centuries was actually conceived of as an instrument which sounded one octave higher than the notated music when played. Here is an excerpt of a performance of the chanson Ami Souffré, featuring Tessa Roos, Jon Marteling, and myself playing the tenor of a piece transposed up to the higher octave. Even though Tessa sings the highest notated or cantus voice, in reality, the flute sounds higher to our ears. I performed it this way because the original part would be too low to fit the range of the traverso, and, inspired by the words of the ultimate Renaissance flute scholar, Anne Smith, I believed that hearing the tenor voice in the higher octave brought out some interesting qualities in the piece that wouldn't be heard otherwise. Note that the tenor line is also doubled in the true octave by the lute throughout the chanson, so we never lose the correct harmony between the voices. Perhaps to our modern ears, this aesthetic might sound uncomfortable or even wrong. However, this tactic is one that was accepted and possibly preferred in some contexts by composers, performers, and even audiences during the Renaissance. Let's first examine the range of the traverso as illustrated by Michael Praetorius in 1619. He gives the tenor flute a range of 19 notes, from D above middle C to the A 2 octaves higher. He shows the range of the flute in its sounding octave in this table. Later, in Book 3 of his treatise, the clefs he assigns to be used by the multi-voiced traverso choir imply written notes that are out of the range of the kinds of flutes that would be used, and would only make sense if they were transposed higher. Praetorius gives a few other important comments in his treatise. Firstly, he explains that flutes actually sound one octave higher than written, even though it is hard for the ear to discern. He compares the tenor range of the flute to that of the organ, and explains that the flute actually sounds in the register one octave above the sound of the organ. Elsewhere in the treatise, he remarks that a single flute, played amidst other instruments, can really comfortably and correctly play the tenor in the octave above. Lastly, Praetorius compares the sound of some melody instruments in an ensemble playing one octave higher than written to the practice of combining the various stops of an organ in 8, 4, and 2 foot. His comment reinforces the viability of transposing the inner voices of polyphonic music to the higher octave. Now we will turn to a couple of musical examples, which place Praetorius's descriptions of the traverso into a more practical context. This first is the English mixed consort repertoire from the late 16th and early 17th centuries, proliferated by Thomas Morley, William Layton, and others. The English version of this broken consort featured the lute, cittern, bandora, treble viol or violin, flute or recorder, and bass viol. The music written for this kind of ensemble included a tenor or alto line composed for the flute, most often notated with the C2 or C3 clef, and with an ambitus that went well below the possible range of the tenor or even bass flute. Therefore, the majority of these English pieces would have been impossible to play at the notated pitch, and it would have been necessary to perform the flute part transposed one octave higher. Next, let us look at a piece for solo flute, Aurelio Virgiliano's Ricercata No. 4, composed around the year 1600. Virgiliano specified that this particular solo piece was intended for performance by cornetto, violin, transverse flute, and other instruments. The piece is notated with a soprano clef. Here, the C is on the first line of the staff. The range of the piece includes a D below middle C as the lowest note and an E2 as the highest note. Since the traverso can only sound the D above middle C in its lowest range, this piece would suit the range of a tenor flute perfectly if transposed to the higher octave. Thus, even in the solo repertoire for the traverso in the Renaissance, the musical notation implied an obligatory transposition. We can also include German sacred concerti written by Tobias Michael, Heinrich Schütz, and others from the early 17th century, which often features a second, lower cantus voice composed for the transverse flute, reiterating the aforementioned necessity of transposition within a mixed ensemble. So far, I've only given examples of this practice from the 17th century. But what about evidence of the traverso sounding an octave higher earlier in the 16th century? While we don't find specific compositions or pieces of writing to confirm the idea, there are some depictions of artwork from the 16th and 17th centuries that suggest that the flute was used to perform an inner voice of a polyphonic work, one octave higher than the other instruments or voices involved in the ensemble. The first painting we can look at comes from the workshop of the anonymous Master of the Female Halflings from sometime between 1520 and 1530. There are several versions of this painting which depicts three women performing the chanson Jouissance vous donnerai from part books. One sings, the other plays the lute, and the third plays one of the parts on the flute. In one version of this depiction, the flute player reads from the tenor part book. Again, this tenor part travels lower than the sounding range of the tenor flute she plays with in the picture. Our flute player here must be transposing into the higher octave. Another image of a similar situation comes from Antwerp in 1585, in this engraving of a group of musician angels by Jan Sadler. In this extremely detailed image, the musicians are performing a 5-voice motet by Cornelis Verdonk. Here, the traverso player looks upwards, possibly reading from the alto part, again notated in the C2 clef and going well below the sounding range of the tenor flute. The examples presented in this video, among numerous other written and pictorial evidence, confirms that the traverso was thought of as an instrument whose sounding pitch was one octave higher than other instruments. The evidence shows us that flute players not only utilized this transposition tactic as a necessity of playing with other instruments who sounded at the notated octave, but they even transposed music one octave higher when performing solo repertoire. Thanks for watching, and let us know what you think in the comments. As always, you can subscribe to Phaedrus on YouTube and follow us on Instagram and Facebook. And you can find a bibliography for this video in the video description.